My name is Claudia McCullough, and I'm the director of the Jackson Center for Ethics and Values, and we are proud to sponsor this series called Tea and Ethics. And if this is your first time here, you see why it's called Tea and Ethics. We have some house rules I want to go over with you before I introduce today's speaker. House rule number 1, once the speaker starts, I ask you not to leave. It's very, very impolite. If you're just here to be seen and you don't want to attend the affair, I think you should leave now. We ask you not to leave while Dr. Rauhut's speaking. I promise you this, and those of you who've been here before know I keep my promise. At 5:30, I call time. Because there are some of you who are here during your class period. I really appreciate that. And so at 5:30, we call time. And then, if you want to stay afterwards and still chat with Dr. Rauhut, that's fine. But I will not keep you after 5:30, so that's our trade. I promise you that. But I need for you to stay once it begins. Second house rule, please turn off your cell phones. Please do that now. And I know that's hard to remember. And believe me, I sponsored a talk in which I made this little talk about cell phones, sat down and the speaker began and my cell phone went off. So I know that it's really hard to remember. So if you'd be so kind as to turn them off. Third house rule, once we begin, if you run out of tea and you think to yourself, I really need another cup of tea, come back and get it. I can't tell you our supply is endless, but it's yours as long as it's there. So please feel free, if you'd like a refresher on tea, to go back there and have some hot tea. What do you need? I'm getting a sign. Are we running out of seats? All right, we're going to need some of you to push in. If there's some seats around you, we're running out of seats. There are a couple of seats down here on the third row. Everybody, I don't want you to have to stand up. If this is your first adventure with us in Tea and Ethics, I can guarantee you this, you're really going to enjoy it. We're all about starting the questions. We're really not about answering all of your questions. And here's what we tell you. If you leave this auditorium today and you never talk about this subject again, then we have failed you. We want you to start talking about the subject. That's what we're doing. We begin the dialogue here. And so I hope you'll do that. Some of you are doing an evaluation for me in Dr. Bass's class, and I greatly appreciate that, and because it will help us in our further efforts. Most of you have gotten a schedule of our Tea and Ethics this year. They're great subjects. They're professors from all over this campus who give us their time and their knowledge, and it's really fun. I hope you have a good time today, and I know you will. I want to go on and introduce Dr. Rauhut. Here's some seats down here, if you need those. There are a couple right here. Brian, there's a seat right there in the middle. I am really excited about today's presenter. I am proud to tell you that he is not only my good friend, he is also a colleague. I'm a retired professor of philosophy, so Nils and I worked together for many years, and I really enjoy working with him. He is one of the great prides of our philosophy department, and so without any further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Nils Rauhut, and if you'll come on down, Nils.
No problem. Well, thank you, Claudia. For those of you who know me, I actually like to move around a lot, so this is a little bit unusual standing up here behind this microphone, but I think we'll manage. So right now, am I in the picture? Yes. Let me tell you a little bit about what the basic idea here is. I'm really not trying to lecture at you for a very long time. I'm really, perhaps for the most part, just trying to set the stage for a discussion. And the title of the discussion really is the relationship of virtue ethics to sexuality. And perhaps you are a little bit puzzled of what that means, and that's good. It should become clearer as I set the stage. The overall spirit I have in mind here, similar to what Claudia said, is that perhaps in the tradition of Socrates, it is the greatest thing to explore these things together. So at some point, I will ask you to work through a question together with others in the audience. And I know that the seats are not ideal for doing this, but with a little bit of goodwill, you might be able to kind of talk with a couple of you about a question, and perhaps we will be able to talk together rather than me just talking at you. All right, let's get going. I've chosen a picture here to introduce perhaps part of the question. If you look at the picture, the figure on the right is a satyr. In Greek mythology, he is very often seen as symbolizing sexual desire, sexual passion. And he is very interested in a nymph. And she is, as you can see, not particularly happy about that interest. And I don't know, what do you think is going to happen? This picture kind of doesn't really tell you this, but what would you think would happen? Any suggestions? Yes, Donna.
I think he's going to have his way with her.
Oh, you think there might be some kind of sexual violence going to take place? Well, I can tell you that's not what's going to happen. This is Greek mythology. So, any other suggestions? What else could happen? And by the way, if that were to happen, that would be very bad for our image of the relationship between virtue and sexuality, because that would mean that the two really are completely incompatible. What else could happen? Anybody? Yes, go ahead.
Hero comes along and saves her?
Yeah, somebody could come along and save her, perhaps like a god, like Zeus would come and save her. That's not bad. That could happen, but unfortunately, she's not really being saved, although indirectly. Let me tell you what happens to her. She eventually just realizes she has no option, right? He's so close. And she asks her sisters, the nymph of the river, to transform her into grass. So she actually is transformed, and the satyr is very disappointed because she's now transformed she's part of the river landscape, and of course that transformation is a one-shot deal. You never come back from it. And so perhaps in some ways the picture is somewhat tragic, right? This overarching sexual interest is really, so to speak, doesn't have a happy ending. Nevertheless, I think I want you to take this picture perhaps as a little bit of a preparation to think a little bit about the relationship between being virtuous, having all the virtues, and having sexual interests. And in many ways, I think human beings want both, right? We have desires to be fully virtuous. We want to be good, virtuous people. But we also have sexual desires and inclinations. We have sexual interests. Now the question is, can we somehow get them all together into one package? Or is it perhaps somewhat a tragic relationship that somehow it is in virtue of our sexual desires that we can never completely be virtuous? So, in order to set the stage a little bit, I want to start by telling you a little bit about virtue ethics. And after I've done that, just so that we have perhaps some common vocabulary, and after I've done that, I will then kind of lead you to the central question which I would be focusing on, because in many ways, this relationship between being virtuous and having sexual interests is perhaps a very wide field with many questions. And as you will see, I will focus on one particular question later on. So let's see whether this works, and we'll actually then now take a look at a couple of very brief description of virtue ethics. Oh, there it is. What is virtue ethics? Now, can you perhaps do that, Adam? Or just put the button? Okay. Virtue ethic is a way of thinking about normative ethics, which can be contrasted with two other traditions. when you do normative ethics, meaning when you give prescriptions of how you ought to act in life, one way you can try to figure out what you ought to do is by look at the consequences of your actions. And that might be, maximize the good. Another way is that you might want to stick to certain rules, right? That's a way which you can do normative ethics. Somebody might say, just don't tell a lie. Don't cheat anybody. Don't hit anybody over the head. And as you grow up as a child, you have seen these approaches to ethics. Parents tend to stick with the rules approach, right? They give you certain rules and expect you to stick with that. And also, on the other hand, there's approaches where people always think, calculate consequences. Now, virtue ethics has a different focus. Virtue ethics does not focus that much on rules. It does not focus that much on thinking about consequences. But virtue ethics is the kind of theory which focuses on character. Okay, now how is this supposed to work? How is character supposed to work when we want to make good actions? Perhaps you can click on the next thing. The basic idea of virtue ethics is that if you develop a good character, somehow, if you succeed at that, somehow later on in life you will tend to act well. Okay, not always perhaps. Sometimes you make mistakes. But on average, given you have a good character, you will have a tendency to contemplate your options well and make good decisions. How do you get this good character? Well, that's a little bit tricky. but it is at least something all parents are shooting for when they're raising their children, right? As a parent, you spend long hours and long days, and you always hope, me spending a lot of time with my children, I hope they will develop good character. It's not a science, but in many ways, virtue ethics says, you have to pay a lot of attention to moral education and hope that if you help people develop a good character, then they will do fine. For example, right now, many of you are in college, you have to make many decisions. A virtue ethicist would say, if your parents, if your community, if your relatives have done a good job raising you, then they don't need to give you a rule book. They don't need to give you a complicated formula how to calculate consequences. They will basically say, look, you will be fine, at this point. Of course, it's always an ongoing project. You might want to improve your character and so on. But the main point is, in virtue ethics, the key feature which makes people succeed when it comes to making decisions is a good moral character. Can I get the next point there? So, in virtue ethics, then, we understand a good character as being characterized by having the virtues. And there is some controversy about how many virtues there are and how important the virtues are, but we need not to go into this. You all are familiar with virtues like honesty, compassion, moderation, courage, loyalty, and justice. And there is perhaps more of those, but right now I think that's enough to give you an idea of virtue ethics. Basically, have a good moral character, develop the virtues, and then hopefully you will be the kind of person making the right kind of decisions. Let's keep on going. Now, we need to understand a little bit more precisely what actually a virtue is. I've given you examples of virtues earlier. The one thing is that to realize that virtues somehow are not something you can have just because you do something once or twice. You do not develop, or you're not worthy of being described an honest person just because you were honest yesterday or did an honest thing yesterday. And you're also not worthy to be described to be a compassionate person just because last Christmas you gave a nice present to your mother, right? Having these virtues is things which characterize you all day and every day. It goes, as one moral philosopher says, all the way through. So if we click on this a little bit more. Virtues then are very complex, well-entrenched dispositions that involve emotions as well as choices, values, attitudes, perceptions. It's a complex thing, what exactly being honest consists in. But for example, I have you an example here. Go ahead. For example, being honest would involve feeling outrage or disappointment in seeing somebody lie. That's one component of being an honest person. When you see people being liars, it really rubs you the wrong way. For example, if you're not emotionally affected by somebody being a liar, that would be incompatible with being a virtuous person. So there is this emotive aspect to the virtue, but in addition, there's also, I think, a cognitive aspect to that virtue, namely that an honest person, for example, thinks that honesty is perhaps sometimes much more important than success in life, right? So there is, in addition to being a person who feels a certain way, there's also required in order to have the virtue that you think about the world in a certain way and make certain kinds of judgments. All right. This is just as a background because as we go later on a little bit into the subtleties of the argument, it is important to realize that virtues are very complex states of affairs and that at minimum they have an emotive as well as a cognitive aspect. If you keep that in mind, that will be great later on. Okay, now starts the fun part, all right? What does virtue ethics have to do with sexuality? Okay, can you click twice, please? All right. I want to focus on these two cases. I'm not quite sure everybody knows these people, but you might know them, but you might not know that they have something to do with sexual improper behavior. So the first one is John Edwards. And as you might all very well know, he was a candidate for the office of the presidency, but somehow it didn't turn out that well because there was this reported affair he had with a person on his staff, right? Is that right? I don't quite know what happened recently on this, but needless to say, I think it has become quiet. I haven't heard much from John Edwards recently, right? He has kind of disappeared, and it seems that in many ways he has disappeared because of this affair. Very similar, the case with Eliot Spitzer, the former governor of New York. He too was a star for a long time, I think, and suddenly he has become very quiet. He had this affair with a very expensive call girl, and there was like huge numbers involved, and anyhow. Now, why do I want to focus on these two people? Well, it seems to me that in both cases, John Edwards and Eliot Spitzer, these people are actually pretty virtuous. They are both highly intelligent. They both have worked great for the public good, right? They have committed resources in things of improving the world. I think that these efforts were genuine. Eliot Spitzer took on Wall Street, and how much Wall Street needed taking on, I think, has become obvious in the last couple of days. John Edwards has really generally tried to work for eradicating poverty in the United States. I think it was heartfelt, right? So these people are not just any ordinary bad persons, just the opposite. They have a lot of very, very admirable characteristics. So the question that I want to focus on is, and if you click one more time, Adam, when people like John Edwards and Eliot Spitzer, people who are courageous, intelligent, and loyal family men, as far as I can tell, both of them were very dedicated to their families, act sexually improper, are we justified to conclude that their character is flawed? That's what I want to focus on. And again, it is important to focus on people like this. I'm not talking, for example, about a person who has never shown himself to be virtuous acting sexually improper. You might not be at all surprised by this. I'm talking about people like John Edwards and Eliot Spitzer. So this is where you come in. I want you to respond to this question. It's a yes or no question, right? Do you think that once you hear this information in the news, that you are justified to conclude that they have a flawed moral character. And if you answer this question with a yes, then I would like you to add further on, in what way is their character flawed? That's what I would like to know. So let's take a little bit of a break here and, work with other people and answer this question, what you think, and especially work on the question of, in what way do you think is their character flawed? All right. Can you take a couple of, can you take a couple of, I hope you had a little bit of chance to reflect on this. Let's see, let's take a vote here. How many of you think that after you have heard the information about John Edwards and Eliot Spitzer, you're justified to conclude they have flawed moral characters? How many? How many of you think that they have not flawed moral characters? Wow. That's pretty 50-50. That's amazing. Okay, I'm amazed by this. Let me just say, I'm amazed because it seems that that is not how that is treated, right? In the media, at least, this is treated as a death sentence. And what that means, of course, is that the media is implicitly is assuming that once you find out that information, you know that they are wicked, right? So this is interesting. We are pretty evenly split about this. Now, let me ask those of you who think that they are morally flawed, in what is wrong with them? Let's see, perhaps we... Yes, what's wrong with them?
Not very honest.
Not very honest. Can you say a little bit more? Like deception, they were deceiving?
Yeah, and not much of a family man.
Pardon me?
Not much of a family man. He wasn't really there for his wife.
Right. So there's a certain implicit breach of trust towards the family, which it seems to indicate that they weren't honest after all. Okay, good point.
They're not loyal either. They're not loyal to their wives, to their families. They're going out with other women, you know?
Right.
That's not loyal.
So we have honesty, we have loyalty. Okay.
I think that for the position that they hold, it's not like a normal person, it's any other person on the street. They're constantly in public eye, so, you know, the value, how we hold them higher than we would any other person because they are in need. I think that has a lot to do with it. So, given their position, I think that there's a lot of smart decisions is
Right.
not there.
So is your point that because they are such public figures, the moral standard for them is higher? Okay. Anything else about why they are morally flawed? Yes?
They're not compassionate.
They're not compassionate. You want to say a little bit more? Right. So it seems a similar point as made by the two gentlemen here. Breach of loyalty, breach of trust, they're not honest. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Does sexuality, male or female, have anything to do with how you approach this subject?
Try to clarify. Do I implicitly distinguish between male and female sexuality?
No. I think a male would take, a different approach, or it's approach A, where a female might take approach B.
You mean the question will be answered differently by men and women, this one?
Could be.
Why? So you think men would construct kind of self-justifying reasons for being sexually improper? Okay. And then women would actually be harsher on men? I don't know. Does that seem right? It could very well be, but I don't necessarily think that I would have a stance on this one way or another. I think it could be that men might be more forgiving than women, although, one of the interesting things about these cases, right? Their married wives always show up at the press conference, right? So they don't seem to be that harsh. I mean, at least not publicly, perhaps, right? So. Right. Well, let me just give a chance to the other side of the divide here. Who took the position that their character is not flawed, or perhaps not flawed? Okay. Can you say a little bit why you think that?
You have to look at these characters in the totality, not in just one thing they did. Yes, they were flawed, but the issue is that there are many people that are flawed, many, and even in public life, if we took and knew all the flawed people, we probably have to get rid of half the representatives in the country. So we have to look at the totality of it, and that men are men at certain points in their life.
So the moral standards from men is different than from women? Okay. Right. Okay.
Don't once in a while look at another woman or feel something towards another woman.
Right.
Now, here's the question. Is it just because it's a sexually improper act, or is it not intelligence? Are they therefore not, is their character flawed that way? You can't judge them harshly. You don't make the grade.
So, tell me a little bit more. So what do you think? I didn't catch the first part of what you said acoustically.
I think that people judge more harshly just because it's sexually improper due to religion and other things. They've been taught that way.
So in some ways, we see sexual improper behavior as more fundamentally a character flaw than other shortcomings. So if we find out that George W. Bush didn't have good grades at Yale, which I think is true, and that would indicate also a slight character flaw, namely that he hasn't really dedicated himself to his studies sufficiently, but in some ways we are not as disturbed by that character flaw as by this sexual character flaw. Is that, yeah, I think that's a good point. We put a lot of awful attention on how well you behave with respect to sexuality compared to other fields. I hope some of these points will come back at the discussion at the end. I want to move a little bit on, and I want to kind of present you with what I think about this case. And I'm really not quite sure I'm getting this right, and I might very well be persuaded to change this. But my thesis, roughly speaking, about this case is as follows. Okay. I think even the most virtuous men with all of the virtues, cannot reliably incorporate sexuality within their lives. In addition to virtues, they might need something which might be called moral luck. Let me try to explain this, first of all, what the thesis is, and then we'll kind of clarify this. It seems to me, first of all, I'm focusing on men here, therefore that was interesting what you said, and I really think this is important. It seems that this is predominantly or more a problem for men than it is for virtuous women, as far as I can see. And this might actually go to very deep questions about male and female sexuality, which I don't really understand fully, but I would certainly think that there might be a distinction we have to draw. But I want to focus on men, and so there's a certain kind of sexism here. Secondly, it seems to me that basically the idea is that you could have all the virtues, but the term moral luck means that there might be certain non-moral factors interfering with either determining whether your virtuous character succeeds or doesn't succeed. And I think in this sense I would like to go in this direction and basically say that even if you have developed all of your virtues, that perhaps you might need a little bit more than virtuousness to do well in these kind of situations. Let me then take a little conclusion. Oop. No, it's not working again. The consequence, can you click it one more time? The consequences for Edwards and Spitzer, rather than feeling moral outrage about their behavior, and rather than saying that these men have deeply flawed characters, we should see them in a tragic light, perhaps, as men who have had bad moral luck. So I guess my thesis, which is perhaps somewhat outrageous, is that Spitzer and John Edwards, rather than we are responding to them with this kind of like, oh my God, what kind of terrible scoundrels. But rather what I would suggest is that perhaps people say, you know, what a tragedy. What a tragedy has happened to these gifted men who could have served their country so well. And I would put the emphasis perhaps on the part that they had somewhat of bad moral luck. But of course what you can see is I'm shifting the blame here away from the individuals to, and I think the idea there is that perhaps there is something about sexuality rather than in virtue where we have to find the causal explanation here. Let me try to clarify my thesis. Can I have the next picture? So what I'm trying to say here is I do not want to say that all sexually improper actions by men are caused by bad moral luck. In many cases they are caused by bad moral character. However, it is possible that they are caused by bad moral luck. So at least there are tragic cases. I bring up here Bill Clinton because my thesis would certainly, I don't think, cover him. Now again, I don't know Bill Clinton very well. I don't know John Edwards very well. I don't know, but with Bill Clinton, as far as I know, his character seems flawed with respect to sexuality. If we can believe the stories, there was a consistent pattern of improper behavior throughout his life, and that's something you cannot excuse, right? There's a difference here between somebody repeatedly acting improper. And for the moment, I want to assume the cases of John Edwards and Elliot Spitzer are different, right? They only, if at all, did it once. I don't know. I might be mistaken. They might be as much like Bill Clinton as possible. I'm assuming it. And I focused on these people because we know them from the public light. I could as well have chosen different examples. What I'm trying to say simply is that there might be a possibility that somebody is fairly morally virtuous, has developed the virtues, but still somehow does not manage to incorporate their sexuality well in their lives. Now, as I said, I was surprised that so many of you were actually on my side initially, but we will see. I think that there are many objections one could raise to this, and good objections. And part of what I want to provide in the last couple of minutes while I'm speaking is I want to give you reasons, I give you objections, and then I give you some reasons for why perhaps the objection doesn't work. And eventually, what I think I will just stop, and you can raise further objections, and I can see whether we can respond to those too. So let's take a look at objection number 1. This is illustrated by this picture. I don't know whether you can see this very well, but this picture is supposed to be a man who's, obviously invited to go to bed, but he kind of says, no. I don't want to. And what this is supposed to illustrate for me, can you push one more time? This is the Saint Objection to what I've just said. And this is actually well established in the literature. Can you push one more time? The Saint Objection basically says the fully virtuous men are not interested in sexuality at all. They are celibate, and to be virtuous means to be kind of saint-like. And, certainly there's a long tradition in thinking about virtue where this was advocated, right? That, for example, if you go into church there, and, if you're really a good, virtuous character, you would not get married. And not only would you not get married, you would also have no sex, right? Now, that's not for everyone. And so if you are a weaker version, then you actually get married. But the idea was that the saint, the fully virtuous person, would not be interested in sex at all. And so if you take this position on virtue, then of course you would say that my thesis is radically mistaken. Because I say that the virtues cannot fully control sexuality, whereas this says, well, yes, there is a control for sexuality. It's the Nancy Reagan approach. Just say no. Just say no. Don't do it. And then, of course, you can't act wrong, right? Now, I am not entirely persuaded by this objection. So I guess my view is that there is something wrong here. And I think what is wrong here is that I think the idea that the fully virtuous person, so to speak, gives up on sexuality completely does not seem realistic and does not seem psychologically adequate to me. I think that ultimately speaking, the fully virtuous life should and ought to contain sexuality and sexual actions, and I'm somewhat suspicious of the saint-like version of virtue. Now, there are some people who are advocating this, right? But so anyhow, this is as far as it goes. I think it's my main response to the objection is that it's psychologically not adequate, and also I think it gets us the wrong idea of virtue. I think abstinence is not a virtue. Now, in the right time, at the right form, yes, but not, no interest in sexuality at all. So that's the first objection. We might come back to this in our discussion. Let's now go to the second objection, which perhaps is a little bit more complex and might take more time. A second possible objection to my thesis might be, fully virtuous men have the virtue of moderation. This is interesting because you didn't talk about moderation. You talked about honesty and other things, but I thought that the key virtue is, when it comes to sexuality, is moderation. So one objection might go as this. Fully virtuous men have the virtue of moderation. Being moderate implies that they can resist improper sexual temptation. So anybody who gives into sexual improper temptations is not moderate and thus has a flawed character. I think that's not a bad argument at all, at least at first glance. And I think this, in my view, is the strongest objection. Namely that you cannot hold my thesis that a fully virtuous person would not act always sexually proper, because the fully virtuous person is supposed to be moderate. And moderation would guarantee that you make the right judgment at the right time. Okay, and so John Edwards and also Elliot Spitzer are not moderate men. They are lacking moderation, and that's what's wrong with them. Well, let me try to respond to this objection. Can you click on it? One more time. Oh, can you go back? In order to respond to this objection, or at least try to respond to the objection, we need to think a little bit about how moderation is supposed to work. Moderation, and I'm taking here at least partly the Aristotelian account of moderation. Aristotle cast moderation out as our ability to regulate the pleasures of touch. And it is thus concerned with food and sex. So the idea is, for example, a person who's not moderate with respect to food enjoys being touched by food in their mouth too much, right? You just enjoy that pleasure too much, and therefore you always refill your mouth with new food. But you do it too fast, you do it too often, and the result is not only immoderation, but the result is a certain amount of unhealthy living. Aristotle thinks about the same issue being true for sexuality. Just like the immoderate person with respect to food is unable to control their pleasures of touch, when they eat something. So in the case of sexuality, again, the key pleasure is the pleasure of touch. And you cannot moderate that, and that seems as a fundamental character flaw. So this is how moderation is supposed to work. What I would like to suggest is when we look a little bit closer how moderation works in the case of food, we might be able to see that the analogy between moderation in the case of food and moderation with respect to sexuality eventually breaks down. And therefore I think, this is at least what I'm trying to develop, is the idea that moderation when it comes to sexual impulses is just not always reliably doing its work. Unlike in the case of food, where it actually is reliably doing its work. So let's take a look. I take the case of food first. So how does this supposed to work when you have the virtue of moderation with food? Well, a moderate person will not eat too much because A, she has only modest desires for food, and that's the non-cognitive aspect of the virtue. So one aspect of being moderate with respect to food is that you just are not constantly thinking about food. You're not constantly desiring food. So one of the features of moderation is that actually there are whole periods of times where you don't even think about eating. You actually forget about it. You haven't even thought about it. You have other things to do. Right? That's would be part of being moderate with respect to the pleasure of food. B, there's also the cognitive aspect of the virtue, that you're able to make good judgments about when eating is appropriate and conducive to a good life. This is all of you who take nutrition classes, right? You're practicing that aspect of the virtue. You know what the food will do when, what food groups you have to eat, and then you make the right judgment. Today I eat a banana, and tomorrow I eat a pancake, and it will all work out. But the point is, there's two aspects to being moderate about food. You have a moderate desire, and you have good judgments when it comes to what kind of food you eat. And the two come together. If you have this, it works reliably. So, in the case of food, for example, I would agree if somebody, let's say, is not very moderate with respect to, there's something perhaps deficient in their character. Let's now go to the case of sexuality. Can the same model work for regulating sexual desires? And here, I guess, if it were to work, it would work like this. A moderate person will not have inappropriate sexual relations because A, he or she has only modest sexual desires, you know. That's the non-cognitive aspect, right? You're somewhat not constantly thinking about sexuality and so on. And B, he's able to make good judgments about when sex is appropriate and conducive to a good life. Cognitive aspect of the virtue. Now, and here's where I think I want to kind of blend over into discussion. What I would like to suggest is that moderation with sexuality can work, and it can work well. But what I want to say is there is moral luck involved. Why? Take case number A, having the kind of character where you have only modest sexual desires. I think I would like to suggest that if you are in this situation or if you're lacking this situation, perhaps there's not as much control in changing this as in the case of food. Okay? So there is what I would think perhaps a certain luck in the character there. And B, to be able to make good judgments about when sex is appropriate and conducive to a good life. Here too, it seems to me it can work out well, but I think that our cognitive control over making judgments about sexuality, if it works well, cannot work reliably well as in the case of food, partly because sexual desires are not transparent in the way in which other desires are. Let me try to explain this. This is a kind of a Freudian point. When I, for example, am hungry, I can introspect myself and I can reliably tell whether I'm hungry or whether I'm not. So this means there's a transparency there. In the case of sexual desires, I think that transparency is missing. What that means is that I might self-introspect myself, and I might say, hey, am I attracted to X? And I might say to myself, no, not at all, not interested. And I might seriously believe it, but it actually might be false. Meaning that in the case of sexual desires, our self-reflection is not transparent, it's not reliable. And because it is not as reliable as in the case of food, cognitive control is perhaps much more difficult. So to make the idea close, I think if you can close, and perhaps you want to click one more time. So part of my argument is that these two aspects, and I put crosses through there, do not work as well in the case of sexual desires as in the other one. So let me quickly then come to the conclusion here. What does that mean then about these two cases? Perhaps in the cases like Edwards and Spitzer, there might be cases of bad moral luck rather than bad moral character. And what that would mean is that perhaps there's room, at least in some point, to look at them as tragic persons rather than as flawed persons. Now, you told me, how do I know this? I don't. But it is certainly kind of possible. Okay, if you click one more time. I have tried to raise some objections and respond to them. I'm sure you have many others, and I hope that at this point we might have a little bit of discussion. Okay, thank you. Yes?
The one thing that I didn't like about your thesis, and it might just be misunderstanding your definition of moral luck, but I don't like how moral luck seems to release them from taking responsibility for their actions. I think that good people can behave badly, but they should still take responsibility for those.
Right. No, it's a wonderful point. Thank you. I think I understand what you're saying, but I don't think I'm committed to this at all. Let me try to give an example. I think you can very well take responsibility even for things which are not fully in your control. So, for example, let's suppose I'm driving a car. It is very icy, right? And as far as I can tell, I didn't do anything wrong, but I crashed and I hurt somebody, right? Let's suppose for the moment, really, that I could have been the best driver in the world, but I was unable to prevent this, right? So I would say there's a little bit of bad luck involved. But I can still take full responsibility. I step out of the car and I say, look, I did this. I crashed into you. I hurt you. I'm responsible. Even if I couldn't have prevented it. You see, so it is not the case that in the moment where I admit that there are circumstances which are beyond my control, my moral responsibility goes out the window. Does that make sense a little bit? So even if you are not fully in control, you can take full responsibility for what you did. But sorry, there's somebody in the back. Yes.
Spitzer paid for sex with a prostitute.
Yes.
He broke the law.
Yes.
The laws that he wants us to abide by. It is not a desire. He done something. Not sexual. Paying her wasn't sexual. Paying her was to be sexual. He broke the law. It's a bad rule. Bad character.
Yes. So that's a good point. So you're focusing on the specific point of Spitzer, and you say there's much more involved in this case than just this kind of giving in to sexual temptation. There's also many other actions he committed. He planned this very carefully. He was sneaky. And doing all of this clearly would indicate he was lacking fundamental moral controls, right? Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I must honestly say I don't know the case well enough to know all the details, but I could very well be persuaded away from this particular case. But I would hope that I could modify the case to present you with a case where you might then, you see that you might be willing to accept the thesis. Nothing hangs on Spitzer and Edwards. I just gave them as examples, and they might have not worked out very well. But at least in principle, I would still hold on to the possibility that there might be cases similar where, I think there might not have been as much wrong with their character. Yes?
First, I'd like to try to clarify on the Admiral law. I think the point you might be really trying to get to, correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's a difference between somebody that's had a long history of not having this particular virtue, like you said, Bill Clinton.
Yes.
Before, versus someone who's done it a one-time deal. Doesn't mean they're exonerating themselves from responsibility, but it's having a history of a person's not.
That's certainly part of it, exactly. I think that somebody who has a history of repeated offenses clearly has a flawed moral character, right?
Well, as far as subjection goes, just a little alteration of your second objection. I think if you went with the whole virtue of honesty instead of moderation, it's a much more powerful objection because most of the time the proper sexual behavior is in the context of a relationship or a family situation. And in those kinds of situations, you've made an agreement with somebody else. If you were married, you made vows saying, I will make you abuse. Well, if you act in a proper sexual way, it's not even just because it's sexual that it's probably shut down so hard. It's because you lie. So if we can't trust you with something that's fundamental as marriage or being in a relationship with someone, why would we trust you as a person in general? If you distrust someone, you're wanting to...
Nils, can you repeat the gist of the statement so we can have it on the DVD?
Okay. This is now a challenge, but I think if I understand you correctly, right, your point was the objection is that we should really focus on honesty and loyalty?
Yeah, pretty much.
Because there is a certain amount of breach of loyalty and honesty in marriage, right? And that the idea in marriage is that fundamentally I'm committed, and that should be strong enough. Now, to come back to in response to this, and I'm not quite sure that Spitzer and Edwards are the cases I want to focus on, but let's focus on a person who's fully committed, let's say, to their relationship, and they are virtuous, right? But could it not be that perhaps there are certain circumstances where they're unable to, live up to that deal? It is the question always the case that at each given point you know now that the person is dishonest. Remember what I said at the beginning of ascribing a virtue to somebody? Doing something once or twice is not sufficient to be called virtuous. But doing something once might also not be the case of being sufficient to ascribe a bad character to you, right? But your point is well taken. I think in our understanding very often of loyalty is that if you let me down once, I've had it with you, right? And quite honestly, I'm very sympathetic to this. And, you know, and in some ways, I think we sometimes do this with friends and others, right? If we feel that once they have betrayed us, that's all it takes, right? And we tend not to give them more room. Yes, Matt.
I want to expand on what you said about responsibility. Do you think there's such a thing as moral responsibility and non-moral responsibility? So with your analogy of the truck driver, you were responsible because you took action, but you are not morally responsible because you could have done otherwise?
No. I'm a little bit hesitant to draw a distinction between moral and non-moral responsibility. I think responsibility is one term, one concept. My feeling here is that even if I couldn't do otherwise, I can still say, I have done this. I don't know what responsibility means, but it seems to me responsibility means like, I have done this, and I am the agent who has brought this about, and here I stand. And that's, I think, what responsibility means. And I think there's very well the possibility that I do something, and although I could not have acted otherwise, I take responsibility. Yes?
So would that mean that if I fell on a cactus, and the cactus caused me pain, is the cactus morally responsible for my pain?
Well, no, this is a good example. If the cactus were an agent, right? It's not an agent. But if the cactus were an agent who could speak, right? Then the cactus could say, you know, I did this, I'm sorry. Although the cactus couldn't have prevented this. Yeah, sorry?
One down front, Amanda.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
On what you were just saying, I'm interested in this transparency problem. Because you're saying basically that a person has bad moral luck simply because they have this transparency problem, ability to understand their sexual desires, improper or not. And the problem I see with this is that you're saying that they're able to do a sexual improper action because they're not able to understand their desires in such a way. And that the ducks line in a row, and then they have this action. But it seems that someone would be able to understand the consequences of this action, be able to understand other factors that would allow their cognitive ability to work them against doing this action. So it seems like bad moral luck isn't really sitting well with me.
Right. So let me see whether I can understand you correctly. Let me repeat this. You say, even if it is true, right, that some of my sexual desires are not transparent to me, and I'm not quite sure why I have them, that would still give me a fundamental ability to control them, because I can look at the consequences thereof. If I engage in them, I can, and I can then see that the consequences are bad, and therefore I would not do it. Correct? Let me try to respond by giving you an analogy. I don't know whether that will work or not. Let's suppose, I don't know, you had some traumatic experience in your childhood, right? And let's suppose as a result thereof you have a desire to wash your hands, you know. You're not quite sure why you have this desire, but you have it. It's very strong. It's an urge. And you wash your hand a lot. You know, you're one of these people who runs kind of a compulsive behavior. Let's suppose, you know, and I think this is a case of non-transparency, because you find yourself to have the desire, but you don't know why you have it. As a matter of fact, it kind of bothers you, right, to have it. But don't you think it is possible, even if you know that washing your hands too much, A, that you get into nerves with your family, you know, everybody gets really annoyed with you, let's say, your family life gets disturbed. Where's Amanda? In the bathroom washing her hands. Where's Mom? In the bathroom washing her hands. You know, everybody gets like, so there are really bad consequences, right? And you're able to see the consequences because your family life suffers, right? But would it not be possible that nevertheless you are, you see, in some ways not fully able to control the desire to wash your hands because you don't even know where it comes from? So only when it becomes more transparent to you, i.e., if you do some kind of thinking and find where it comes from, then perhaps you have a chance to control it. No? Not convinced? So you think you always have the chance to control your desires even if they lead to bad consequences? There's no case of addiction.
I think that these are just one instances of bad sexual improper actions. Your analogy didn't work.
Okay. That's okay. That's okay, that's fine. I mean, but anyhow. But yeah.
For those of you that must leave, it is 5:30, and I told you I was